racism, but racism as it exists within the Latino community. Let's break that down a little bit.
Yeah, it's a complicated one. So I mentioned that my mother's family is from Dominican Republic. My father's family is Black, American Black. So I feel when people meet me and realize that I'm Dominican, there's like a calculation that happens in terms of like, what kind of Dominican are you? Are you one that's going to be concerned about race? Are you one that's going to treat me differently because I'm Black? Are you one that's going to, and I feel sometimes like I have to navigate that space.
From other Latinos?
From Black people.
Oh.
Like, what kind of Dominican are you? Are you a racist Dominican or not? Right? Like, and I get that because we have our complications within our community with colorism. We have issues like every community, right? And I think that that's one layer, but then I think the other, that's frustration in one direction. But I think another really interesting part of like dynamics between communities is the fact that in New York period right now, city and state level, we don't have any Latino elected officials. We have all of our statewide electeds are either Black or white, and the same is true on the city level. And so when you look at a community that is so full of Latino people, to never see that representation reach those highest levels, it makes you question what's happening. And that those questions turn into frustrations. And I think that what we've seen lately is the Latino community not feeling supported in its quest toward leadership at the highest levels, and feeling like the Black and Brown coalition that we've built over the years hasn't given for Latinos in the way that it's given for the Black community. And there's something to be said about that, because when you look around, the facts are what they are. But I do worry that this conversation is so wrought with tension, and it, like every other conversation about race, has the ability to go off the rails so quickly and turn into one where instead of trying to figure out how you solve the problem, you're in a situation where you're exasperating it and now you're causing a split. And I just want to say it's also fascinating to me that when we think about minority representation, we don't ever look at how many white people are in office, right? It's always, well, how many seats are there for people of color and why aren't some of them mine? And that is such a scarcity mindset that immediately pushes you to a space where it's me against you, instead of like, well, how is this conversation about us and the larger picture? And so it's a lot of tension. It's not easy. But I do think it's something that we have to acknowledge, that like within our community, racism exists and we yield it against one another. And as I'm Dominican and I speak Spanish, but there are many people, for whatever reason, like, who didn't know I was Dominican at all. And so I've been in spaces where like people just think I'm a light-skinned Black woman, which I am, and we talk and you can hear the talk about Latinos and it's uncomfortable. And then the same thing happens in the other space where people just think I'm a Dominican woman, and I am, and we'll be talking about the Black community in ways that make me uncomfortable. And I think in that moment, it's incumbent on people like me who exist in both spaces to be able to speak up and say, hey, that's actually not true. And boy, let me tell you, it has led to some uncomfortable moments in my life. But you got to do it. You got to do it. I think that I genuinely believe like that's our responsibility, because not many people get the opportunity to be in both of those spaces and be able to represent for the other community and help bridge those gaps.
That's interesting, because you will hear a lot of Afro-Latinos say that they're not accepted by the Latino community.
Yeah.
And they're not Black enough for the Black community.
Yeah. How
can we solve for this? Like, what are the first steps? How do we get out of our own way?
Yeah. I mean, that's $1 million question. I'd be very rich if I knew that answer.
Yeah.
I mean, but I do think that it's a question of culture and shared understanding, in a way that there are lots of things about Black culture that are really distinct from Dominican culture, but there are a lot of things that are very similar too. And I think it's realizing that so much of your experience, irrespective of what language you speak, so much of your experience as a person in this country is rooted in how you present. And so whether someone is rooted in Black culture, but they look like a Black person, just because they're Dominican, rooted in Dominican culture, but look like a Black person, they're living this life in America as a Black person, right? That's how you look. And the same thing is true for white Latinos too, right? If you look like a white Dominican, you are going to experience life completely differently than I do here in the United States and in DR, by the way. And so I think we'd all stand to benefit if we could, I think, reintroduce the nuances in this conversation, because that concept of like, you're not Black enough, you're not Latino enough is really like, these are hard lines that just don't work for something that is extremely nuanced, because you could be darker skinned and have hair that is long and flowing, and that's going to change your experience, right? Or you could be light skinned and have hair that is really coily, and that's going to change your experience, right? And so understanding how the layers and the nuances all interact, and understanding that there's no cut and dry, this makes you Black enough, this makes you Latino enough, this makes you different, this makes you not, I think is a really important part of it, especially as someone, I sit in the middle of both, equally planted in both. And it's interesting because it makes me different from my family, from a lot of my family, most of my family is only Dominican. I have little cousins who are half Black, but they weren't born until I was 20. And so understanding that there are people who have these experiences that are unique, and that doesn't make them any less valid or any less important.
I think also what would help is, and it's an extension of the nuances, but there's a lack of education in the community of why these nuances exist.
Yep.
And what is the root cause of them, because a lot of us are carrying our ancestors' preconditioning, and bringing it into this modern world and having an identity crisis. We're like, oh shit, we're not American enough. How do we hold on to our cultural roots? But then our culture is shifting all the time, right? Even how we are represented in terms of Latino, Latinx, Hispanic, right? So we are constantly in this in-between where our cultura is evolving and modernizing and catching up with the times. And then we have these traditional roots, which are a big part of our DNA and make us amazing and give us competitive edge and advantage, but are also holding us back.
Yes, because many of them are rooted in colonialism.
Right.
And that's important to just note that it's it's in our DNA to think that this is good, this is bad, but really understanding that's a mentality that was really forced on our communities, and our communities have always been made up of everything, and we should really continue to try to get back to that.
Totally. And I think this tension that exists between the Black community and the Latino community is also causing change to take longer to happen, because we're pitted against each other. So colleagues that I have, well, not really colleagues, but clients that I have in corporate, and behind the scenes, they will share with me, especially during George Floyd and the last couple of years, hey, everybody's being promoted into these new roles and they're all Black. What's happening with the Latino agenda? Why are not Latinos being considered throughout this promotion craze when a lot of our experiences are shaped? Latinos were also enslaved, right? And obviously there are layers to that, and there are differences. There are also similarities. And because of this system that we are all trying to fit and succeed in at the same time, it's difficult to not view each other as it's me or you.
Right. But right when you were speaking, I was thinking, I wondered if that person noticed how many white people got promoted. And it's back to that point of if we're making the case that promotions and that this is a meritocracy and that it's whoever does the best should be the best and should get promoted, etc. Sure. But then that means looking at how everyone's doing, not just me and you. And I think that is at the core of it, right? And that's rooted in colonialism, looking at each other, finding the differences and making myself better than you, but it's all vis-a-vis the white person who's doing their own thing. And I think that's a really important thing to try to be conscious of and try to deconstruct. But I also think, to your point, in terms of progress taking longer, that's true. And I think that's at the core of the frustration that you're hearing politically, is that we have seen the Black community's advancements supported throughout the years in a Black and brown coalition. especially here in New York specifically, right? You had the Puerto Rican community that really were the pioneers for Latinos here in New York, and who, working together with the Black community, were able to get to all of these advancements. And the Puerto Rican community saw their gains politically as well. But we've seen those gains kind of eroded. And so I think it's looking to recreate and refortify that Black and Brown coalition that makes it so that neither one of us get left behind. And for whatever reason, in these last few years, the formula is broken. It's not working the way that it used to. And so needing to kind of reconfigure that. But everybody, I think, needs to kind of stop, take a look and say, okay, yeah, something isn't right here. And how do we rectify that?
Yeah, and that is the $1 million question.
Yeah, exactly.
Is like, how do we rectify it at the same time of trying to adapt to this new world that we're all trying to figure out.
Right.
Like where we fit in.
Trying to not get worked out of a job by a robot.
Exactly.
At the same time, it's like trying to solve racism.
Like, geez, I don't know if I could worry about, all of that social stuff when shit, I might not have a job.
It's a lot. It's a lot.
Yeah, it is. It's super heavy.